the avalanches were getting they were really big, and they were roaring past us. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning of the
Yep.
third night. We were all lying down with our eyes wide open, and there was a tremendous roar and splintering of wood and a crash.
Yeah, I remember hearing the noise and the cracking, and I was sleeping underneath the bottom bunk, shot out of there like a flash,
Yeah.
anticipating the building to start collapsing at any second.
In this video and podcast, Hector MacKenzie and Trevor James recall the avalanche that hit the shack in which they and 4 other workers were stranded for 4 nights. It was during reconstruction of a Powerline tower during a major snowstorm in northwest BC. At the time, Hector was an avalanche technician and Trevor was a linesman. But before we get to the story from Hector and Trevor, Scott Flavelle, who was also an avalanche technician for the project, gives some background on the Powerline and the terrain it ran through.
From Camano, there's an 82-kilometer power line that goes along more or less a sea level valley and then up over a 5,000-foot pass down into another sea level valley called Kildala, and then up over a tree line pass and down into Kitimat. There's hundreds of towers along the way. There's 2 twin circuits or twin power lines, and that was completed the very first year in order to have a backup circuit in case the first one failed. For making the aluminum, if the power ever fails, then the aluminum sets up in the pots and becomes a hard material that needs to be chipped out by jackhammer. So it's imperative that the power is continuous from Camano over to Kitimat.
The project, as far as I remember it, and you could correct me, Trevor, was that this Tower 113R had been demolished. It was just reconstructed when we got stuck in the lunch shack right beside it. This lunch shack was right in the avalanche path that took the tower out, the transmission tower.
Yeah, that's correct. The year before, I was an apprentice back then. The year before was the first time the tower got knocked down by an avalanche.
The first involvement with Alcan started in January 1993 after a Tower 113R was destroyed by an avalanche in late December of 92. I got a call from either Colin Zacharias or the company that we worked for. Paul and I were their first avalanche technicians, and we were responsible for the safety of the men while rebuilding Tower 113. Worker safety, of course, there's an avalanche safety program including explosives, avalanche forecasting, when to be on site, when not to be on site. But one of the bigger risks was simply access. Access is all by helicopter. One would not want to spend the night up there. You're in an avalanche bowl, real structure. We had a plywood shack just to get out of the elements in order to have coffee and smokes. Very committing spot. Helicopter access in and out, essentially from 4,500 feet down to sea level every day. And as you can imagine, the weather on the north coast is not generally that good.
I think it was December 26th, the first time the tower got taken out. It was a big slide. I think the avalanche techs went up there and they measured the fracture line, and it was something like 12 feet. It knocked the tower down. It kind of hit it in the belly, and it folded back up the hill. All the lines stayed intact, but the tower was demolished. So we built a temporary tower, you could say. It was designed to lean and move with any avalanche activity. And then that year, November 20th, my foreman called me and he says, "We got a line down." And I said, No. He goes, "Yes, 113. And so that's when our adventure started there on the second time. Rallied all the forces there, brought the groups in. We employed AvTech to come in there and assess the situation. So that's when we started flying the sections in. And that was from December. And I think up until, I think it was in February when we had the final phase raised up and were caught there for the night Yeah, and I remember that morning fairly well. My journeyman that I worked with, Dave Fair, that's since passed. Yeah, I mentioned to him because I kind of bit of a weather nut, living in this part of the world, and I was looking at the weather, and the weather didn't look promising. It looked like it was going to deteriorate. And I
Yes.
said to him that morning there, I said, I don't think we should be going up here, Dave.
There was a tremendous amount of pressure on day 82 to get this thing up and running.
We got to site there and we pinned that last phase up and removed the ground, and the tower and the system was ready to be energized. Yeah.
And that morning, I remember I had come up. There was a full load of us, about a dozen of us flew in, and I decided right away I had to do some blasting. But the problem was that the helicopter spent enough fuel getting me into position to do some blasting, that when we were finished the blasting and he put us back on the ground, he said, I have to go and get fuel. He didn't have enough fuel to stay there for the day and fly everybody out.
I remember Hector standing on the skids, looking back at us, looking at the weather approaching. It was just marginal at that time. I think he realized that the machine may not get back, and being, he was our safety guy, avalanche tech. Give him all the credit in the world. Stepped up that machine.
And you 5 guys were still on the tower.
Yep.
So it was just the ground crew that got into the helicopter and they got out of there. So I made up my mind to stay, and I've been stuck in a lot of winter storms in nasty places. So I figured that I would be a lot more used to you guys who were on the tower than being back in Camano.
The first thing that we did once we realized that the machine was not coming back. I mean, the weather closed in fast when the machine left. It was closing in. And then the first activities we did was gather as much of the lumber that was strewn about the site from the construction and start shimming up the building with wood.
Yes. After the helicopter left, we settled in for the night, and we had a bit of food, and there was a propane stove and a few packets of soup, that sort of stuff. I don't ever remember being hungry. But
no, I think we had rations there. I think after we got caught the first time, that was the thing, is, bedding and all the survival equipment, shovels, sleeping bags, thermarests, food. I think that was all stored there in case. I mean, the idea was never to stay there again, but
yeah,
I think it was prepared because in that part of the country, with the weather can change at that time of the year, it's always better be on the safe side.
Although I do remember there was a young fellow came up from Camano one day, and he had instructions to start cleaning the shack out.
Yes, I remember
and
that.
I caught him taking, maybe a 2-gallon pot out of there, and that was the only pot we had.
Yeah.
And I said, no, you've got to leave that. He said, no, my instructions are to take all this stuff out. And I said, well, we're still here. We could still get stuck here. When we checked all the equipment, I discovered that quite a few of the avalanche transceivers had gone too, and we didn't have enough for 6 of us. I had my own one.
Yeah.
And I think there were either 3 or 4 left.
Yeah.
And the snowshoes were gone. Some of the sleeping bags were gone. The most important thing that was taken then was that small generator.
Yes.
We only had one radio contact with Camano.
Yeah.
And one battery, no spare battery for that one. So the generator gone. We had to make that radio last as long as we could.
And I remember we just would do a timed check-in, I think, in the morning and in the evening there to preserve the radio battery.
I remember the next morning getting these rough cut 2x12s that had come off the top of the tower and cutting some of them into plates and nailing them up across the rafters, 2x4 rafters in this flat roofed shack,
Yeah.
and putting a big plate in the floor, and then cutting a full 8-foot pillar and jamming it in between them and spiking it into place, top
Yeah.
and bottom on the plates.
Yeah.
And
I
there were
remember.
maybe, in that 12x16, there were maybe 6 or 7 or even 8 of them. So it was kind of crowded in there.
Yeah, exactly. It was it made it tight quarters with all the lumber that we had
Yeah.
installed in there. After the first night and the snow that was coming down, the amount that was accumulating um, from the shack looking down to the tower, I don't know what it was, maybe 50 yards, was it maybe?
Not even, I think it was quite a bit less than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you couldn't see because of the snow and everything else. You could not see hardly the tower from that distance. That's how hard it was snowing. And I remember making a plea saying we can't stay here. We got to leave. And we didn't have enough snowshoes. I think everybody entertained the idea of getting up to Camp 11, which was high above all the other peaks that could affect us as far as avalanches go. And we ended up making a pair of snowshoes or a set or two out of the old milk crates that we had there. And we never
Until
got.
we realized there was way too much snow for us to break trail
Yeah.
uphill.
Yeah.
And some of that hill was fairly steep. It would be 40 degrees at some of the steeper sections.
You knew, well, we were in a tough spot with this amount of snow that was accumulating. It was coming down pretty hard and fast.
Yeah, so after that first night, when we got the pillars built inside the shack, I seem to remember some of you linemen went up onto the tower just to do some final bits and pieces for a little bit of time, and then we settled in for our second night in the shack and indicated to the Camano people that we were okay. We were wanting to be out of there, but we weren't in a immediate danger.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I noticed that the winds were picking up and the snow was coming down fairly steadily. And I figured that there was about a meter or a meter and a half coming down every 24 hours. I noticed that on the night of the second night we were there, that the avalanches were running. They were not big ones, but they were running between the door of the shack and the tower. And I reckoned it was maybe 30 meters between the tower and the shack. By day 3, the winds were loading those slopes above us. There was quite a strong southwesterly flow, and it was dumping a lot of snow up above us on the avalanche paths.
Yeah.
They were running more often, and they were quite a bit bigger. They were big enough to rattle the shack, and the tool belts that were hanging on the shack walls were kind of rattling a bit as the avalanches went past.
Yeah.
And I remember being out, just sticking my head out to see what I could see, and I noticed that there was a plywood tool shack between the lunch shack and the tower, and it was gone.
Yeah.
It was blown right over the edge with a whole lot of equipment in it.
Yeah, I remember that.
And it's a steep drop from there down into the valley. So that night, the avalanches were they were really big, and they were roaring past us. And it was about 3 o'clock in the morning of the third night. And I kind of knew none of us were sleeping. We were all lying down with our eyes wide open. And there was a tremendous roar and splintering of wood and a crash. And I was sleeping underneath the one spot that didn't have a pillar holding the roof up. And it was only about 5 by 5, that space I was lying in. And I got my headlight on and looked up, and the rafters were broken like this, and the plywood was letting snow through. I just got a sprinkle of snow in my face, which got me standing up pretty damn quickly.
Yeah, I remember hearing the noise and the cracking, and I was sleeping underneath the bottom bunk. I think there was two bunks above me, and it almost had to be like a cat to get in there. It was pretty tight.
Yeah.
And I come out of there without touching anything. I was amazed that I didn't bang my head or
Yeah.
catch my arm or my leg, but I shot out of there like a flash.
Yeah.
And anticipating the building to start collapsing at any second, basically is what you were expecting with the amount of noise and the wood splintering sounds.
So fortunately, we were all okay, and I decided the time had come to open the door.
Yeah.
And opened the door up, and there was this wall of snow packed hard against the door. And I took my avalanche probe out and pointed it up at about a 45-degree angle towards what I thought should have been fresh air. And it was a 3-meter probe. And I pushed and pushed and pushed, and it didn't break through. So I realized we had at least 3 meters of snow to move before we could get air back into the cabin.
Yeah.
And that was the major concern, that we were so tightly packed in the snow, underneath the snow, and it was so solid. There was no air for us there at all.
Yeah, I remember having we had nowhere to put the snow. We had to shovel it inside the shack.
Yeah, right to the back.
Yeah.
And after I'd shoveled a tunnel of about 3 or 4 feet out the door on the way up towards fresh air and daylight, well, it was nighttime, and you guys were packing the snow to the back end of the cabin. We just didn't know how far we'd have to go. And then used my avalanche probe and managed to break through. And that was, maybe another almost maybe 2.5 meters of snow. So in order to make a tunnel to get out of the place, we had to bring a massive amount of snow. And I chained shovel crew shoveling it all to the back of the cabin, back of the shack. And then we got out. And I remember you and Dave took the first shift of shoveling the roof off.
Yeah. 10 feet of snow.
We decided we'd just have 2 people out at the one time with avalanche transceivers on. The roof was set down in such a hole that we had to shovel it up onto the next level, and then shovel it from there up onto into the snow, into the wind. And the wind carried our shovelfuls of snow away from the cabin.
Yeah.
And I think we spent most of that night and most of the next day, that would be day 4, shoveling snow.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember that shoveling, and then I remember come daylight and we'd swap back out.
Yeah, we were shoveling for our lives then.
Yeah, it was a surreal moment there.
And so day 4, we just spent our time in the shack, just shoveling all the snow out again that we'd had to bring in the night before, and just sat down for another day. And the storm kind of eased off towards the end of day 4, and there wasn't so much snowfall and not so much wind. So I was getting pretty happy that that snow loading with the wind had stopped.
Yeah, it was a relief to see that snow ease off. I remember going to sleep that night after the avalanche, because I didn't tuck myself in that little cubbyhole, and I slept out in the open, and then I had food and snack and drink right at my face level in preparation if something did happen and I didn't suffocate and was there alive, that I'd have some nourishment until someone dug us out.
And then on day 5, it was quite quiet outside. The wind had almost completely stopped. And we were outside having a look to see what was going on. And all of a sudden there was a patch of blue sky above us. So I ran down inside and got the radio and called Camano. And it turned out that the pilot, he was a Yukoner brought up in Rancheria in the Yukon. He was in the air. He was just over the next ridge.
You were checking it out. They could see the weather breaking.
We waited there. I think we all had our rucksacks handy.
Yeah.
And we waited there, and we just saw the belly of the helicopter going over as this blue hole closed in. And we were kind of fed up with that situation. We thought we were just about to get out of there. And Dave Farrer stayed up on the helicopter pad, and the rest of us went back into the shack, not saying very much to each other, kind of feeling pretty low.
Yeah, disappointed.
And then about an hour later, Dave called, and he said, "Come on, get up here, everybody. The helicopter's coming in."
Yeah, I remember getting back up on the hill there, and then you couldn't see, but you could hear the thump of the 212.
Yeah.
And it was one of the nicest sounds you'd hear for a few days.
Yes. And when he landed there, the manager of the project was inside the helicopter. He indicated to us by pointing at the ground that there was a piece of rental equipment, an expensive piece of rental equipment, was on the helipad, except by this time it was probably 2 meters down. And he wanted us to get shovels and to shovel this piece of equipment out of a hole, lift it up, put it into the helicopter. And this took maybe 20, 25 minutes to do this. And by this time, the weather had closed in on us again. And the pilot made this amazing bit of flying when he flew. He faced the cliff on the east side of the tower, and he followed it very slowly, facing the cliff, and he could see rocks, and he just inched the helicopter down and down.
Yeah, so he could maintain his his reference.
He would be maybe 10 or 15 meters off the cliff. He had that bedrock as reference. I'll never forget that when we got down to tree level, I felt such an overwhelming sense of relief.
Yeah.
The tears just poured out of my eyes after.
Yeah, I was looking out the window and trying to avoid looking at everybody, but I had the same experience. The emotion and the relief that we're out of here. We're going home.
Yes, that's right. I remember we didn't look at each other.
Yeah,
but
I think everybody had the same intense emotions, but didn't want to expose it.
Yeah, from there we flew into Camano and spent the night there. Yeah. Sorted ourselves out, had a good meal.
Yeah, good hot meal, a couple drinks.
Yes. I remember the flight out of Camano the next morning was pretty hairy too. And we flew at about between 30 and 50 feet above the ocean. The weather was right down.
Yeah, you had to run the water route.
He flew the water route. And there was enough fog there that there were big chunks of ice freezing onto the main rotor blades. And every now and then one would break off and hit the tail rotor, and the whole machine would just shudder.
Yes.
With this, and I was just shit scared. I was.
Yeah, get me the heck out of here.
Yeah, that's right. And
yeah,
so we all got home safely.
Yeah.
And I had a physician friend here back in Whitehorse who said to me right away, she said, you need some PTSD counseling, and booked me in with a local counselor who debriefed me from my experiences. And
I had the same thing.
Oh, you did?
I got home and I was on my own at home. It was like playing a movie. Stop, rewind, play, stop, rewind, like over and over. And I was thinking to myself, I'm going freaking crazy here. I called my boss the next day. I said, I'm coming back to work there. I can't sit here. And I went there, and he said some of the management there had understood what we'd gone through. And there was a doctor that worked for Alcan at the time. And he happened to be involved in the Hitton train wreck a few years prior to that, where a lot of people experienced the post-traumatic stress syndrome, and suggested go talk to him. Dave never did. I think that affected him for the rest of his life.
I think it did too.
But you know what? I went there and I talked to the doctor, and he explained to me what the mind goes through when you're faced with traumatic situations in your life. And he went through the whole process of what the mind does, and it was just like it was turned off. I understood, and after that I was good. There's probably some lingering results, but for the most part there it stopped the play rewind. But
I felt so bad when I was at home. I couldn't relate to my wife or my kids. And I was just like you, a bit of a vegetable, just going over this whole thing over and over again.
Yeah.
And by the time I saw this counselor, I reckoned I had a bit of an analogy that my life was laying in front of me like a whole lot of broken bits of mirror, tiny bits like a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
And I got as far as scraping it into a pile, realizing that my mind had to sort this out and reform the mirror and the picture of my life and who I was.
Yeah.
And until I could do that, I couldn't get on with my life.
Yeah. It's just something that you have to, at first is understanding and like understanding what it is that's affecting you. You know what I mean? Like it's tough because of, it's all mental. You can't see it.
Thanks to Hector MacKenzie, Trevor James, and Scott Flavelle for recalling this remarkable story from 1994. For more on these three, follow this QR code. For the key changes in mitigating avalanche risk along the power line, search for these words or follow this QR code. Events like this one triggered improvements in workplace safety. The companies that operate in avalanche terrain, as well as the Canadian Avalanche Association and WorkSafe BC, played key roles in improving the safety of those who work in and near avalanche terrain.